This is Tokens. I'm Lee C. Camp. Starting in the 1980s, the city of Los Angeles, California was ravaged by what is now known as the Decade of Death, a period of unprecedented gang violence peaking at 1,000 killings in 1992 alone. It was a time of much unrest, fear, and finger-pointing, turning many of the city's poorest areas into, for lack of a better word, war zones, desperate for socio-economic stability and communal peace. And it was in the midst of this hostility that Father Gregory Boyle became pastor of Dolores Mission Church in what was at the time the poorest Catholic parish in LA, in the most violent neighborhood in the city.
You don't go to the margins to make a difference. You go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different. I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city, as you mentioned, and it started to become quite intense. 8 funerals in a 3-week period, all gang-related homicides. So 1988, I buried my first, and on Saturday, I buried my 249th, and then on Thursday, upcoming, I'll bury my 250th.
Today, Father Boyle is the director of Homeboy Industries, an organization he founded in 1992 for the rehabilitation and reentry of gang members into their local communities. Since then, Homeboy has become the largest gang member rehab program in the world and has been the epicenter for countless stories of grace, redemption, and hope.
Big, huge hulk of a guy sitting in front of my desk, holds his hands in his face and just sobs. And he says, "I have found my purpose here."
Today, a breathtaking interview, really. Wisdom gleaned from a life of taking delight in the person in one's own midst, and the gladness discovered in just showing up. All this coming right up. Father Greg Boyle is the founder and director of Homeboy Industries, the world's largest gang intervention and rehabilitation program, former pastor of Dolores Mission Church in Los Angeles, a native Angelino and Jesuit priest. From 1986 to 1992, Father Boyle served as pastor of Dolores Mission Church in Boyle Heights, which was then the poorest Catholic parish in Los Angeles that also had the highest concentration of gang activity in the city. He witnessed the devastating impact of gang violence on his community during the so-called Decade of Death that began in the late 1980s and peaked at 1,000 gang-related killings in 1992. In the face of law enforcement tactics and criminal justice policies of suppression and mass incarceration as the means to end gang violence, he and parish and community members adopted what was a radical approach at that time to treat gang members as human beings. In 1988, they started what would eventually become Homeboy Industries, which employs and trains former gang members in a range of social enterprises, as well as provides critical services to thousands of men and women who walk through its doors every year seeking a better life. He's also the author of the 2010 New York Times bestselling Tattoos on the Heart and his new book, Barking to the Choir, published in 2017. Welcome, Father Boyle.
It's good to be with you.
Grateful to have you here with us today. You've been at this work in Los Angeles for quite a while now. Would you tell us a little bit about kind of how Homeboy Industries started?
I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city, as you mentioned, and so that was 37 years ago that I first arrived. So though Homeboy is 33 years old, I was kind of working with gang members prior to that. But I was kind of forced to. I mean, I never set out to do anything. And then first thing we did was we started a school because we had so many middle school, junior high age gang members who no school wanted them. So once they got the boot, they were wreaking havoc in the projects, and they were writing on the walls and violent and selling drugs. So I went out to them and I'd say, "Hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And they said, yes. But the main impetus was the fact that I was burying kids. So 1988, I buried my first, and on Saturday, I buried my 249th. And then on Thursday, upcoming, I'll bury my 250th. So that was a kind of a wake-up call for us as a parish. So that was tough. So we started a jobs program and then started enterprises, businesses, because we couldn't find enough felony-friendly employers. So
Take it from some of the stories you tell that it was not necessarily welcomed by all in the neighborhood when you started.
Well, look back, it's hard to retrieve how hostile the wider community was towards Homeboy and the notion of it. So the first 10 years were death threats, bomb threats, hate mail, never from gang members because we always represented hope to them, but, kind of fueled a lot by law enforcement. Many of the anonymous letters were, I'm a police officer, I'm a sheriff, we hate you, you're part of the problem, you're not part of the solution, which always seemed sort of confounding to me because it was abundantly clear to anybody close to the ground that if you invested in them or you engaged them in a positive way, they weren't participating in anything negative. Yeah. And yet they had so been demonized, they were the enemy. So the friend of our enemy is our enemy.
Right.
And so that became untenable for folks. But, the good news is that's a memory that's hard to retrieve. So it's almost, it's been 20 years since that's been so pervasive in Los Angeles, which is to say, I think that Homeboy has helped shift how people see what if we were smart on crime rather than just tough.
In addition to that memory being harder to retrieve, are there other kind of things as you look back that are surprises to you or that you have to kind of remind yourself of that, oh, yeah, this is the way things have unfolded for me?
Well, in the early days, because we had 8 gangs that were at war with each other, so my whole being in the evening was on my big black beach cruiser patrolling. So I would I'd visit all 8 gangs before I went to bed. Sometimes this was,
wow,
till after midnight, and it was a kind of a calming kind of thing where they'd see me and we'd talk and why don't you go inside and you don't live here. I'll come back with my car and I'll take you home or put that Uzi down. Are you sure you want to shoot that guy? That kind of thing. So in the early days, I would do peace treaties, truces, and ceasefires. And I always say I don't regret that I did that, and I would never do it again. It was one of those things. In retrospect, you see that though on paper, it's kind of the outsider view driving the inside of what we ought to be doing. So you think, oh, this is what we should be doing, kind of Northern Ireland, Middle East. Let's get the warring parties to sit down. Huge mistake because it serves the cohesion of the gang, which is not a good thing. And it supplies oxygen to gang life, equally not a good thing. So I look back on that and I go, yeah, it was a natural thing. Now, people still do it all over the country, and they still think that gang violence is about conflict resolution, but there is no conflict in gang violence. There's violence, but it's not about anything. It's not a conflict. So you can't sit the parties down, which is always a kind of a misconception that people have,
So the notion of it giving oxygen to gang mentality or gang identity is simply that I understand you to be saying that when you sit them at a table or invite them to a table as gang members, that's reifying that gang identity.
Absolutely. And at Homeboy, we now say we don't work with gangs. We work with gang members.
Interesting.
And we don't recruit or cajole or coax, and everybody knows where we are. We call it the magic of the swinging doors. You open that front door, welcome. Welcome at Ticker Tape Parade. They come in and a homie said, there's an aroma, it's the whole talk about the kingdom. It's about kinship and connection and people immediately tasting beloved belonging and then wanting that. But we don't try to go out to anybody because it's like rehab. We don't exist for those who need help. It's only for those who want it. So it doesn't work if you don't freely walk in the door.
Right.
Having said that, they're all on a continuum of readiness. It's always like an AA meeting, like who's there, somebody who's 20 years sober, somebody who's 20 minutes sober, and somebody who's drunk, but he's there.
Yeah.
And it's that kind of fluid continuum and spectrum is the thing that always happens.
And do you think then that you use the word addiction and you've alluded to AA, so do you see attachment to gang identity as an attachment or as an addiction?
It kind of is, in as much as, the opposite of addiction is community. And so community will always trump gang life once they have a taste of it. But it's all part of the longing of people. Everybody is born wanting the same thing.
Yeah.
So once they kind of discover that, but in recovery, it takes what it takes.
Yeah.
And in gang recovery, it's the same thing. It can be the birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison. It takes what it takes, but no amount of me wanting that guy to have a life will ever be the same as that guy wanting to have one. So,
Right.
I always say ours is a God who waits, and who are we not to? So you wait for people. It's frustrating because you would like to accelerate people's feeling cherished and nurtured and accelerate the healing.
Yeah.
But it's the same as I don't know how else you can do it except to wait for people to show up and to be as attractive.
You say in your most recent book that you were angrier when you were younger, that you shook your fist a lot. What precipitated a change in you in that regard?
Well, I think part of it was I was bearing so many kids, and there was a kind of a killing of Karen Toshima, who was killed in Westwood, which is where UCLA is, and it's kind of a shishi foo-foo neighborhood. It's where you'd go to movies and nice dinner, that kind of thing. She was a graphic artist and was on a date and got caught in the crossfire, in gang crossfire, and she was killed. And then suddenly, it was a $25,000 reward. All these detectives were dropped from lots of cases and assigned to this one. Police presence was intensified, and the reward was offered for information that would lead to the arrest and conviction of whoever did this. Now, at that juncture, that was kind of the climate. And at that moment, I was bearing 8 kids in a 3-week period. And it was clear that one life in Westwood was worth, the 35 I had buried at that point. And so you wanted their lives to matter, But that was a different time for me. I suspect I was, you get indignant when you're younger, and you don't want to settle for moral outrage when you should hold out for moral compass, and they're not the same.
Say that again. That's so helpful.
Moral outrage is kind of where we get stuck, where we shake our fist. And the hard truth of moral outrage is when I am outraging, it's about me. It's self-congratulatory. It strikes a high moral distance between me and others, and we settle for moral outrage. But we ought to hold out for moral compass. So moral outrage points things out, but moral compass points the way. You want to be able to point the way. You want to say, over here. But let's imagine this. And then you insist on the undergirding principles that are so essential. We belong to each other, and every single human being is unshakably good. And that's where I begin. Once you start there, you won't fall prey to the seduction that just has you shaking a fist. And basically, not just denouncing something, but insisting that it be about me. It's subtle, I think.
Subtle, but wow, it's terribly helpful distinction. You pointed right there to one of the themes that recurs repeatedly in your public speeches and in your writing, that of kinship. Would you describe how that functions for you in thinking about your work and in doing your work?
Yeah, you don't go to the margins to make a difference. You go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different. And so then it ushers in this kind of exquisite mutuality. I remember there was a woman, I was at a conference in Rome, and we had this kind of social justice conference or something, and we were in small groups. And this woman with great sadness said that she had left work with refugees, really undeniably difficult work. And she felt guilty about doing that. And then she said, I think, there were some moments of joy. And then she proceeded to talk about successes, outcomes, measurable things. And I thought, she's mistaking success for joy. And they're really quite different. Mm. And so the essential piece of kinship is to purify your narratives a little bit. Nobody has ever attended a graduation ceremony that didn't say, go and make a difference.
Yeah.
But make a difference is really about, if I'm there to make a difference, then it's about me. If I'm there to rescue, save, or fix, then it's about me. And if the principle is, it can't be about you. So in the gospel, when Jesus says it's really hard for rich people to enter the kingdom, it's not about bank accounts, it's about humility. And that the understanding of Jesus of rich folks is that there's not a lot of humility. It's really hubris. And so can you receive people? And there was a homie I met in Houston who doing hardcore gang intervention in the streets of Houston. And he said, how do you reach them? He kind of pleaded with me after a talk. How do you reach them? Meaning gang members. And I said, well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? Huh. Now that's a whole other stance that's different. That's not, I'm going to go make peace. I'm going to enter into relational wholeness with people. That's hugely mutual. Hmm. And I'm going to only begin and only do one thing, which is I'm going to allow my heart to be altered. I'm going to be reached by this person. Hmm. I'm going to receive. When I took this course from Henry Nouwen at Harvard Divinity, I remember a woman asked him, what is ministry anyway? And he was quite frustrated with the question. He said, can you receive people? He said, that's it. Can you receive people? Which again feels so passive if were it not for the fact that it's the most liberating thing for somebody to be received.
Yeah, and when you say somewhere that you've decided that key to all this is simply the practice of showing up.
It feels like you're not making something happen, that you're not making a difference, which is why people burn out, because it's about them and they're trying to fix and save. But if it's about the other, and if all you do is love being loving, and you receive people and you allow yourself to be reached and heart altered, then it's eternally replenishing. You will never burn out. I mean, it's kind of the key. And I think that's an important thing, especially in ministry as people want to serve. It's hard to enter into kinship with people if it's about you or if it's about hubris rather than humbly accepting people where they are.
I love the story I've heard you tell about, I think you call him Mario, perhaps on a trip back to Gonzaga, which I think exhibits so well this kinship and unexpected kinship. Would you be willing to share that with us?
It's funny stories that, you kind of retire them, and you don't tell them for a long time. But I remember he was quite panicked, he and another guy, and we were going to go to my alma mater where they had forced the incoming freshman class to read my book against their will. And so, I've taken endless homies with me on trips, and they're all kind of panicky, But I've never seen anybody like this. We were at Burbank Airport, which is kind of small. And it's one of those tarmac airports.
No breezeway.
There's no breezeway. You have to walk out onto the tarmac and climb the stairs to board. And he was like hyperventilating, and I almost had to go find a bag that he could breathe in. And I remember I saw two flight attendants, female flight attendants, and they both had Starbucks coffees, and they were schlepping up the steps. And Mario, with great desperation, when are we going to board the plane? And I pointed at the flight attendants. As soon as they sober up the pilots, we'll be able to get on the plane. And then I remember I walked him around the airport, and this is saying something because we get about 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors. He's the most tattooed individual who has ever worked there, which is saying a lot. Huh. I mean, his arms are all sleeved out to his fingertips, neck blackened with tattoos, entire face covered in tattoos. So I'm walking him through the airport trying to calm him down, and I was just startled at how people would clutch their kids more closely and step away. And I thought, wow, because to this day, he still works there. If you were to walk in and ask anybody who's the kindest, most gentle soul here, they wouldn't say me. They would say Mario. And the day won't ever come that I have more courage or I am closer to God than this guy. So we get to Gonzaga, and I remember they have the big talk, on the evening of Tuesday evening or something. But what they don't tell you is they have all these classrooms that you're supposed to visit throughout the course of the day. So I said, look, I want you guys to get up and talk, and because I'm going to speak tonight, and they were absolutely panicked, but they did a good job, and it's stories of terror and torture, and honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance, otherwise you'd get scorched. And I look back, and I think I wouldn't have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So I don't think I did this that regularly, but I said, get up before me and just give a little snapshot so that I could, include you in the question and answer period. And it was like standing room only packed, thousands of people sitting on the floor. I mean, total violation of fire code. And so they get up, and especially Mario was petrified and trembling, but they did a good job. And then I did my 45 minutes. Then I invited them up, and I said, yeah, questions. And a woman stands up. I got a question for Mario. First question out the gate. So he's just a tall drink of water, skinny guy, gets up to the microphone. Yes. And he's terrified. And she goes, well, you say you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What advice, what wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? And Mario stands there getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with the right answer. And I can tell he's starting to kind of crumble under the weight of it. And finally he just ekes out, and then he stops. And then he kind of holds his face in his hands, and people don't know if he can continue. And then he says, I just still want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands and says, with great tears, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they won't stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And they were reached by him, which returned them to themselves, which is the way it's supposed to work.
Thank you. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. You're listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life. We're most grateful to have you joining us. If you've not yet done so, subscribe today to the Tokens podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Special thank you and welcome to all our new subscribers we found via CastBox. We do love hearing from you all and are always pleased to hear some of the things you'd like to hear more about. You can email us at info@tokenshow.com. Also, remember you can sign up for our email list or find out how to join us for a live event, all at tokenshow.com. We would be most delighted to have you come join us in Nashville. Shout out today to the non-predominantly English-speaking country with the most Tokens podcast listeners, Iran. Excellent to have you all joining us. This is our interview with Father Gregory Boyle. Coming up, more beautiful stories of beloved belonging. Part 2 in just a moment. Welcome back to Tokens and our interview with Father Gregory Boyle. That phrase you ended that story with, returning to ourselves, that's another one that shows up often in your writing and your speaking. And I'm about to share a quote from the poet Galway Kinnell, but I will say that especially in Tattoos from the Heart, on the Heart, I want to go back and just collect the quotes you've got in there that hold these stories together. There's so many beautiful, and it's like, you know, you got Merton, you've got Wendell Berry, Pema Chodron, Emily Dickinson, Mary Oliver, and so forth. It shows your MA in English, I suppose. It's being put to good work there. But you quote Galway Kinnell, sometimes it's necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness. And it seems that this is a particularly helpful way to construe what it means to be human, you know, to return to ourselves. I love, and my students, I'm sure, get tired of hearing me talk about Irenaeus, 2nd century, you know, the glory of God as a human being fully alive.
That's right.
And I hear that phrase you use, being returned to ourselves, is sort of synonymous with that sort of vision of life.
Well, I also think, you know, I mean, it's a wonderful poem. It's a little bit like people talk about second chances. And there was a homie who worked at the Silkscreen who actually is the supervisor there. And he said, whoever gave them their first chance.
Mm.
And so it's reteach somebody their loveliness as if it had been taught to them before. So that's kind of a misconception because it often hasn't been. But when you talk about unshakable goodness, there are no exceptions to that. And part of our being stuck in moral outrage is we think there are plenty of exceptions to the, you know, unshakable goodness piece. So you have to kind of believe that every human being has that, the loveliness that is their truth. And surely there are things that impede people from seeing that truth. You know, it's about the human being, glory of God, fully alive, but it's also the glory of God, you know, in holding the mirror up and reteaching loveliness and telling people that truth. Carl Rogers talks about prizing, which isn't so much praising. You know, it's about this notion of fully accepting a person and then prizing who the person is. And that is about the most foreign land that anybody has traversed. And at Homeboy, you know, which is kind of it's the front porch of the house everybody wants to live in. It's a model, I guess, of a paradigm that could be different, where only in a community of beloved belonging, where everybody's engaged in repairing and attaching and repairing severed belonging, because everybody, that's where they begin. They've had belonging severed. And it's never too late to repair that and to attach. We have an 18-month training program. That's what they sign on for. And they get paid, and they're supposed to, you know, they'll work in a bakery and et cetera. But they're also equal parts working on themselves in group, in therapy. But the whole culture heals, the whole culture of the place. So if it's true that a traumatized person is going to, you know, likely to cause trauma, it's equally true that a cherished person will be able to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. So then they are reteaching loveliness to others. And so then it becomes, that's where the joy is. But the 18 months, it was, how did we arrive at that? We said, well, a year is probably too short. 2 years is too long. Okay, 18 months. But then we looked back, and then just by kind of a coincidence, that 18 months is the time it takes, they say, for an infant to attach to the caregiver. And we went, that's it. We hadn't thought of that. But then it became, our reason was, this is about attachment repair, where people who, all of them are a 9 or 10 on the ACEs, on the adverse childhood experiences spectrum. I'm a 0 on the ACEs, and I grew up in the same city as these folks. But that's just, if you want to talk about white privilege, that's just, the lottery of my parents and zip code and education and siblings. But then you can stand in awe at what folks have to carry and what brought them to walk through the swing of the doors at Homeboy.
Yeah. In one of your chapters, I think it's entitled Disgrace, and you tell the story about it. I think a young woman coming to see you who's kind of undone one day, and she says, I am a disgrace. So you work a lot in that chapter with this notion of undoing shame. And as you look back and think about poignant instances of that, what are some examples of how that's happened, or people in whom that's happened, or what's that looked like for you to see the undoing of shame or the dismantling of shame so that a new healthy attachment can occur?
Well, Marcus Borg, the scripture scholar, says that the principal suffering of the poor throughout scripture and history is shame and disgrace. And I think that's quite right. And so it's the pervasive sense, not so much that they've done wrong, but that they are essentially wrong and that they can't shake that. And so the only way to counteract that huge power in their life is to offset it with, seeing them as God does, which is easy. You're not pretending. I'm going to pretend that there is a reason to prize this person. That part has always been easy, and it doesn't feel like it might be, tattooed, menacing looking folks. But like during the pandemic, because I have leukemia, they set up this tent outside in the early part of the pandemic. And it was, think more Lawrence of Arabia. It was just a huge white with windows. It was quite spectacular. It had a rug and my desk and, and they kind of surprised me with it because they were just petrified of me actually being in the building, So we have a security guy named Miguel, who's just the largest guy, who has ever worked there, and has a big shirt that says security on the back, and so he's kind of traffic cop. So he's escorting people in, make sure they have their masks on, and then he shows them how to leave, how to exit. And so I'm watching him, and he's, especially with the younger homies who came in to see me, and the whole thing is kind of the Godfather will see you now, and so they bring them to me, and they're 6 feet apart and all this kind of stuff. And so then he would direct the young guys out, and I would hear him say, hey, Papa, you can leave this way. Now, Papa is something you would call your son. And it's very affectionate. It's a loaded word because it's just steeped with a very healthy, good father-son relation. Papa, if you could just go out that way, very tender. And then a homie comes in later on, and he sits down and he says, that guy back there? And he points at Miguel and he says, well, he's my worst enemy in the whole world. And right now, he just gave me advice that consoled me, which seemed like a incredible word to use. And then, he left. But at the end of the day, I called Miguel in, and I wanted to prize him, sort of, and I wanted to say, hey, I noticed how you would say papa to the younger guys. That was so tender and cariñoso, affectionate. And then I mentioned that kid who was his enemy, and he knew exactly who I was talking about. And he so valued your advice to him. Well, he just, big, huge hulk of a guy sitting in front of my desk, holds his hands in his face and just sobs. He says, I have found my purpose here. Now, this is a guy, when he was 12, lived with a stepfather who just would torture and beat his mother. And he was sexually abused by 3 adult relatives. And one day he came home and he couldn't find his mom, and she was tied up and gagged in a closet. And his stepfather once had thrown her through a window, like you see in the movies. And so he killed him. He was, whatever he was, 14. And he went to what we called then youth authority, which is where they send very young, seriously offending kids. And he was there till he was 25. And then they sent him to prison for an additional 10 years, and now he works for us. But he's found his purpose, and I've never had to carry what that kid carried. And so it's reteach his loveliness, but loveliness was a foreign land for a kid like this. But now he loves being loving. And was he always unshakably good? Yes. Did he always know it? Rarely.
I want to close that section with another quote from your book, quoting Belden Lane. Divine love is incessantly restless until it turns all woundedness into health, all deformity into beauty, and all embarrassment into laughter. As you said at the beginning, you started doing what you did not because you set out to go look for it, but because it needed to be done. And that's informed, it appears, a lot of the stuff that you've done, like even tattoo removal. I think you've started as this was something that needed to be done. Well, what's been the significance of something like tattoo removal, for example?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, just everything, when Ray Stark, who had $500 million, wanted to help, and how should I help? And I said, well, I don't know, you could buy this abandoned bakery across the street from our school, and you could fix the ovens that don't work and that kind of thing. So had it been something else, had it been an upholstery shop, we would have had Homeboy Upholstery or something. Yeah. Everything was quite random and reactive, and people come to our headquarters now, which is huge and impressive, and how did you think this up? And the truth is, you don't think things up, you evolve. And so tattoo removal there was a need, and we did it, and we don't force anybody to get their tattoos removed, but it's all part of their own desire to, turn their life around. I mean, in the early days, we had just 1 hour a month from a Dr. Van Noor at White Memorial Hospital who would remove tattoos. And I remember a homie came and we were trying to limit alarming tattoos, neck and face, elbow down. And he lifted his shirt and his whole chest was covered with the name of his gang. And I thought, well, keep your shirt on, and no one will see it. And he goes, my son will. I go, okay. I mean, it's so painful. It's so arduous. A tattoo like that would have taken 30 treatments, painful treatments. But he was willing to do it. And that was in the recovery mode. It took what it took, which is why we don't ever... I remember once we had a kid who court ordered to get his tattoos on his face removed. And once he was off probation, he just put them all back on.
Hmm.
He didn't work at Homeboy, but I knew him in a probation camp.
Yeah.
And they would transport him there, and since he was under order, even if a minor comes in with a parent, which requires a parent permission, we always isolate the kid and say, hey, do you really want this off? If the kid says no, we won't do it.
Yeah. I wondered, so you said a moment ago, this week you'll be conducting your 250th funeral. And I hear what you're saying about on the adverse childhood experiences. Your friends that you're working with, a lot of them are 9 and 10, and yours was a 0. But I also look at your ministry and think about the trauma of doing 250 funerals like this of young men and women that you love. And so I wonder, how do you take care of your own self? How do you deal with what surely has to feel traumatic at times in tending to yourself?
Yeah, you learn, as a woman who I buried named Moreno used to say, death is a punk. He said that when his brother died in his arms, and the guys who shot him came back to see if he was also dead, and he had to pretend as he was lying there that he also was dead. And then 2 years later, he was killed. But after his brother died, he said, death is a punk. How is that different from death wears your sting? Or Paul says, death had no power over him. It couldn't hold him, it says. And so it doesn't mean that you kind of don't feel things. But if you don't put death in its place, then you'll be toppled by it. You'll be toppled by life itself. And so coupled with, how do you stay anchored in the present moment, and how do you delight in the person in front of you? Because that's all you have, and we're only saved in the present moment. So that keeps at bay a certain thing. You don't get depleted because you are delighting in the luminous now. Now, that may feel like you're not grieving, but you allow grief to not leave you where it found you. Grief sort of loosens you, and you allow that to happen. But most people kind of look at maybe what I do for a living, and the presumption is that would be hard. And I've never had that experience. I really haven't. It's mainly delighting, only because you choose. You choose to cherish with every breath you take, and you choose to delight in the person in front of you. That's hard to do because you have to decide today, and then you have to decide tomorrow. And it's never once and for all, but it's, the practice doesn't make perfect, but it makes it permanent. And so you are able to continue to do that without being depleted, and it's eternally replenishing because it's mainly people being tender with each other, and you laugh a lot. So the presumption is that death would win, and it doesn't if you put it in its place,
The third main topic that I wanted to raise with you is the one, again, you just pointed to, and that is delight and gladness, which is another kind of thing that keeps repeatedly bubbling up in your writing. You tell this story about being on a live radio show and something funny happening, and then you're driving away, and you said, I steep in the utter fullness of not wanting to have anyone else's life but my own. Which reminded me of one time hearing Stanley Hauerwas read a paper in which he opened up with a phrase from an Englishman who was an Oxford-trained writer and then had decided to go back home and be a shepherd. And in one of his essays, this Oxford-trained writer who's a shepherd is reflecting upon one day, looking at the sheep, and says, quote, "This is my life. I want no other," end quote. I remember Stanley saying, this is what it means to live life, is to find yourself, as you look back upon your life, being able to say, this is my life, and this is what I'm grateful to receive, and this is what I want. But could you share with us more about what does it look like for you to learn to delight and to learn to practice gladness?
Well, at Homeboy, there was a homegirl who was giving a tour. We always had, 3 or 4 tours a day in big groups and from lots of countries and all over the place. And so the homies give tours, and they're walking through, and I heard the homegirl say, "Here at Homeboy, we laugh from the stomach," which everybody knows exactly what that is, that it's deep, it's profound, it alters you, it's not superficial. And so, again, during the pandemic, on his break, a guy named, we call him Chamuco, and Chamuco means, it's kind of a playful name that in Spanish for the devil. It's kind of affectionate, actually, Chamuco, because he has 2 big devil's horns tattooed on his forehead. And he works to his credit, he's getting them removed, but he works in the bakery. So he comes in and he's, dusted with flour and has his apron on and he has his hairnet on and he has a mask on. So this is during the pandemic, and he's standing in front of my desk. And during the pandemic, I was able to fix his teeth, and he wanted to express his gratitude. So he says, "Can I take off my mask to show you my grill?" They always say grill when they talk about to show you my grill. And so he's kind of broadly smiles and big Colgate smile. And then he looks at me and he says, "Not only did you pay for this smile, you are the reason I'm smiling." And then there was this silence, and he goes, "Hey, that's good. Write it down." And so I started to write it down, and he's redictating it. And not only did you pay, and I think he was just hoping to get in my 3rd book, and he did. He right under the wire. I begin my epilogue with that. But the 2 of us, we just laughed from the stomach, and he went with me before the pandemic with another guy, Robert, and we went to Sacramento to give some talks. So we got in later than I like to on a Sunday night, and so we're at Sacramento Airport. We're going to, the shuttle bus to take us to the rental cars. And so we get in, and I'm sitting across from this guy, Robert. Well, Chamuco goes and sits in the back, at the very back of the bus. And then, people start to fill in the bus. But as soon as they see him, nobody wants to sit on either side of this guy. So they assiduously do this foxtrot to avoid him until finally there are only 2 seats left on either side. And people very reluctantly sit down next to him. And then we start to go to the rental car thing. And if you've ever been there, it's a very kind of wooded, secluded, dark, and somewhere in the middle of this wooded and secluded place, the electric thing just, all the lights go off and the bus shuts down. And for some reason, everybody is silent. And you can hear clicking that, "Sorry, I'm working on it," and silent. And in this dark, secluded place, this voice from the back of the bus says, "I saw this in a movie once. It does not end well." Well, the whole bus laughed from the stomach, and it was so joyous. And at that particular time, I'm almost certain that half the bus voted a certain way in a presidential election, and the other half voted in another way. But somehow, this kinship was brought to you by the guy with the devil's horn sitting at the back of the bus that nobody wanted to sit next to. And suddenly, kinship so quickly, and connection and beloved belonging brought to you by this guy.
We've been talking to Father Gregory Boyle, founder and director of Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, California. Thank you so much for your time and for your work and your goodness and delight in the world. Thank you.
Great to be with you. Thanks.
You have been listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life. If you'd like to hear more stories of courageous peacemaking in the midst of great brokenness, check out our episode with Irish poet, peacemaker, and theologian Padraig Otuma. And if you'd like to hear more about the practice of vulnerability and undoing our own shame, then make sure to check out our episode with Dr. Kurt Thompson on his book, The Soul of Shame. Remember, you can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, CastBox, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And we'd love it if you'd go over to Apple Podcasts and give us one of those glowing 5-star reviews. We'd be most grateful. Got feedback? We'd love to hear from you. Email us text or attach a voice memo and send to the address podcast@tokenshow.com. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this podcast possible. Executive producer and manager Christy Bragg of Bragg Management. Our co-producer Jacob Lewis of Great Feeling Studios. Associate producers Ashley Bain, Tom Anderson, and Brad Perry. Engineer Carrie Harmon and Patrick McDermott. Music beds by Zach and Maggie White and Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening, and peace be unto thee. The Tokens Podcast is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.